Okay, so I haven't done a film review for a while. I thought it would be about time. Last night I saw Train to Busan. It's a South Korean zombie apocalypse film directed by Yoon Sung Han. And at this point, I should say this is an English language video, and I apologize in advance if I mispronounce any Korean names. Um, so basically, this is a film much in the sort of tradition of zombie apocalypse films, i.e., there's an infestation, zombies take over, they attack people, people run for their lives. So that basic premise isn't really abandoned. But it is also in the more recent tradition of zombie films, say post 2000, which rely a little bit more on realism of pandemics. What I mean by that is I've seen a number of zombie films, and I think there's a difference between the old zombie films from, say, the 70s, where they really are kind of a bit silly. And I'm not saying they're not entertaining, but they're a bit silly, and it's all about, the living dead trying to get your brains. With more recent zombie apocalypse films, and there's been plenty to choose from 28 Days Later, 28 Weeks Later, and just this year alone, there's been Train to Busan and also another British film, which was The Girl with All the Gifts. I wanted to get around to see that, but I didn't. I believe that's a zombie apocalypse film about an infection, but I'm not 100% sure. Certainly looking at the trailer, it seemed to be that way. Um, I should say, though, in 28 Days Later, they describe it as the rage virus. I really enjoyed 28 Days Later at the time. I thought it was a very powerful film. And what it sort of relied on, the reason I'm making the comparison here is because I think there are some similarities. They focus on presenting the zombie outbreak as real news event. So it's not an old like 1950s shock horror type film. It's portrayed as a pandemic, as a major health issue, where people have been infected. And the difference with this film and older films is that it brings in sentiment to the story. Now, some people might say that's a bit tacky and it's supposed to be a zombie film, but actually, I think it quite worked. We do live in a world where we constantly face the threat of pandemic. This year, it's been the Zika virus. Last year, the Ebola outbreak. There's been H5N1, the Mexican flu. There's been a range of pandemics in recent years, and indeed throughout history now in recent years. Those pandemics have all got very big media coverage and have caused considerable concern. So I think the angle that these modern zombie films take is that these really are like pandemics. What the hell would we do if such a disease broke out? So basically, the film stars, I'm going to name the six main actors. I won't say the character names as well because I'll mispronounce them. But basically, this is the premise of the story. Gong Yu stars as a divorced hedge fund manager or fund manager, and he's seen as a little bit like typical rich guy, a little bit full of himself, but he has redeeming qualities. He clearly loves his daughter, and he's somewhat hurt by the fact that she thinks he doesn't care about her. And there's a scene at the start of the film, this is bringing in the sentiment, of course, where he kind of misses her singing audition and she's upset about it. So for her birthday, he decides to bring her to Busan. Presumably, the film is set in Seoul. Interestingly enough, Seoul is not mentioned once throughout the whole film, although it starts off in Seoul. Other major South Korean cities are mentioned, but Seoul isn't. Anyway, her mother lives in Busan, and that's where he decides to bring her for her birthday. Then there, and his daughter is played by Kim Soo Am. Then perhaps as a major secondary characters, although this is an arguable position because there are other important characters, but arguably the major secondary characters are Man Dong Seok, and he plays a tough working class guy who has a pregnant wife, who is played by. I'm just looking at my camera because I've taken the picture from the Wikipedia page here. Um, She's played by Jung Yoo Mi. That's the Jung Yoo Mi born in 1983, not the Jung Yoo Mi born in 1984. There's two Korean actresses with the same name. Anyway, he plays a tough working class guy, as in physically tough and a little bit argumentative, but a loving husband who cares very much for his pregnant wife, who obviously is in a fragile state. And they form quite a big premise of the film as well. And then finally, there is a young high school student and his girlfriend, or the girl that he's kind of saying to be with, close friend, whatever you want to call it, um, played by Cho Woo Shik, and the girlfriend is played by An So Hee. So they're the main cast. Again, apologies if mispronounced any of that. So basically, and there are spoiler alerts here if anyone hasn't seen the film. So basically, it starts with this young girl rushing onto the train just as the doors close in Seoul. And she clearly something's wrong with her. Her leg is infected. It looks almost gangrenous or like there's a blood infection. And she has a string around it like she's pulling on it. There is also a homeless man who snuck onto the toilet. Well, in one part of the train, one of the attendants sees this young woman and asks if she wants some medical help, and she tries to help her. Meanwhile, one of the male assistants speaks to the homeless guy and says, "Sir, if you don't have a ticket, we need to get off at the next station." So all very routine stuff. But then in the next scene, you see, well, not the next scene, but in the next sort of sequence, you see this stewardess or the train attendant kind of stagger up the train with the young girl on her back and she's biting into her neck. Of course, this is where it begins. Everyone looks on in horror. Now, the homeless man isn't infected, but he has obviously seen what's happened somewhere else. So then, basically, and there's some other significant characters. There is an elderly pair of sisters who are traveling together, and they have slightly different personality. One is more headstrong, one is more caring. There's a lot of in a sense, moral messages in this film. But anyway, I'll get to that afterwards. So basically, the train starts heading to Busan, and gradually they start to hear what's going on. You sort of see the news sequence periodically come through on the screens. But then, as each person is bit, of course, it infects the next person, and you see this bombardment of people kind of rushing up the train. They're all infected, and all the sort of traditional creaky zombie moves, I should say, and motions. And anyway, they're surging up the train, and eventually, the hedge fund manager and his saves his daughter, and he gets through. But the working class guy and his wife are still running through, and they're not infected. And initially, the hedge fund manager closes the door, and of course, this provokes some resentment between the two key men in the film. The working class guy goes, "Asshole, we were okay," and then the hedge fund manager's like, "Well, we don't know that." Um, I shouldn't keep calling him the hedge fund manager. He is the main character. Um, Let me just get this right. I just don't want to mispronounce names. That's all. So yeah, Young Yu, I believe, is a big celebrity in South Korea. So apologies for that. But anyway, um, yeah. So basically, they manage to block it off, and they work out that the zombies cannot see people. They're blind, or they can only see directly. So someone has the idea to throw water over the train door. Incidentally, at the very start of this film, you see this farmer going through a quarantine site and he accidentally knocks down a deer. The deer gets up and it's obviously infected, so that's just a little pretext. So the train is going at high speed to the next city, Daejeon, where it randomly stops. Daejeon station is completely abandoned, and then the military checkpoint there turns out to be infected. So they then attack everyone, and there's all hell breaks. There's like a battle royale in Daejeon Station. Some great scenes in that sequence, and at that point you start to see some turning points. The little girl tells Gong Yu that he's very selfish because he only cares about her. He doesn't want to save anyone else. Meanwhile, because they're on the phone in a private conversation, he's told he's arranged to have kind of special treatment. The little girl resents that. She says we should help the others or tell the others. But the homeless man has overheard the conversation. He kind of joins in. Anyway, to cut a long story short, in that sequence, the working class man and his pregnant wife help the little girl. And at this point, certainly friendship would be the wrong word, but they grudgingly work together. And what I like about this film is it shows how in big disasters, let's just imagine this as a real disaster, they sort of are blind to class in a sense because you have the hedge fund manager who's obviously well off. You have the working class guy who's working class, and then the homeless guy. So you have three levels of the social scale, but they're all survivors and they all have to work together. Then there's also another kind of tragic backstory where the young Gook who plays a high school student and his girlfriend, they're the only survivors among the high schoolers, and he has no choice but to fight his own friends, or at least the other two men do. So there's this sequence where during this fracas in Daejeon Station, everyone gets split up. The some of the main survivors, so the two elderly sisters, the little girl, the pregnant woman. So basically, the women and the homeless guy are split from the other three guys. So they find that they're in two different cars. The zombies are in between. They manage to get onto the train. So it's a really cool scene, and it reminded me a bit of Old Boy, actually, if anyone's seen Old Boy, where the tough guy kind of puts on this cellophane on his arm so that he's not bitten. And they had no choice but to fight their way through. Initially, I thought that what they were going to do is climb onto the roof, but obviously it's going too fast for that. So they literally fight their way through the carriage. It's an amazing sequence. And they finally get to the loved ones. So then the young guy phones his friend. I should say, actually, mix up the chronology a bit there. His friend is still on the other train with the other survivors. He phones her to tell her to let them in. But there is a train conductor who's very arrogant and very self centered, and he's very paranoid. Well, perhaps understandably under the circumstances, but the point is he's an asshole. Anyway, as they finally get in, and they've worked together to do this, um, something has already happened, and that is that the working class guy, physically very tough guy, he personally holds all the zombies back, and the hedge fund manager, I really do apologize for giving them these titles, um, kind of says that he kind of has to leave him because the guy's been bitten. He knows he's finished, and that's it. But he kind of does a noble deed. He holds out to the last minute. Then, obviously, his pregnant wife sees all this, so she's in despair. But anyway, the interesting thing about that, oh, I'll get to that in a minute. Anyway, they get through, but when they finally do get through, first of all, the main character attacks the train conductor for being such an asshole. But then the train conductor kind of turns to the others all paranoid and says, "Look, he's infected," and of course he isn't. But they all start treating them as outcasts and force them to go to the next carriage. So that's quite an upsetting scene in that sense. Anyway, when the train finally gets to Busan, there's yet another kind of climax where all the zombies get out and it finally boils down to just a few survivors, and they finally get out, and there's some great cinematography there, and they kind of one by one grab onto the train, so they gradually slow it down, and basically to round it up, it ends up with the manager, his little girl, and the pregnant woman. And the way it ends up is the manager kind of fights with the train conductor who's been infected. Um, and he knows he's going to die, so he tells the pregnant woman to look after his little girl, and he kind of does the selfless thing and throws himself off the train. So that's it, basically. There's another scene I should mention. This elderly sister who did survive, she kind of goes to join her sister because she kind of says, "Oh, it's all shit. What's the point?" There is some funny lines in the film that aren't really meant to be funny, but they are. Um, so that's it. Apologies that my synopsis hasn't been quite constructed very well, but I am going solely on memory. Anyway, the train does finish up in Busan, and there is a military checkpoint, and it ends up just a little girl and the pregnant woman coming through, and there's a tense moment where the soldiers don't know whether to shoot or not, but the little girl's singing a song, they recognise it, end of story. So out of 10, I give this film, for what it does, actually, for what it does, I have to give it 10. As a zombie apocalypse film, 10 out of 10. It was a highly enjoyable film. If you like a good zombie movie, I can't really find any fault in it. I honestly can't. Um, a thoroughly watchable film. It is one of the highest grossing South Korean films of all time, and South Korea is fantastic at making horror films. If anyone has seen The Host, I imagine this has broken the record for The Host. But it is a very watchable film, and what I liked about it is how they got the different. They did break down the social barriers to work together. So the homeless guy, the working class guy, and the hedge fund manager, although they're from different social backgrounds, they all find sort of redemption, and they're all actually turn out to be brave men. And as does the young college student. So there's a lot of chivalry in this film, by the way. That's an interesting kind of side feature. There's the working class guy who helps his pregnant wife, obviously, and the hedge fund manager who, in the end, doesn't just care about his daughter, but he also cares about the pregnant woman. So there's a lot of chivalry in this film, and it's very, yeah, it's just a very good zombie movie. I really can't fault it. Um, Fantastic special effects, and it's like I say, it takes the pandemic thing and makes you believe that this is could be a real thing, but at the same time, it doesn't take itself too seriously. So there's all the classic zombie sort of Living Dead type thing. So it's just a perfect zombie film, and possibly the best I've ever seen. I mean, 28 Days Later, I really enjoyed as well, but possibly this had a lot more action than 28 Days Later. So for that reason, maybe put slightly higher. So yeah, if you haven't checked it out, check out Train to Busan. It's just a very good film. And once again, sorry to Korean viewers if I've mispronounced anything. But yeah, it's an all-round good film. It is limited release in the UK. I really want to see it, so it was only on the screen for three nights. Pleased I did see it. If you can't see it in the cinema, get it on DVD. Really good movie.